Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from Ceephax Acid Crew, Box Steady. You know, given I fully exhausted the topic of Square Pusher on this channel years ago, I think I'm really long overdue to talk about his younger brother. Ceephax Acid Crew, sometimes just known as Ceephax, is the alias for Andy Jenkinson, and he's made a name for himself in the acid techno and IDM circles in his own right. How about that? Two brothers who both make IDM and acid material and get some level of critical and fan acclaim out of it, totally separate from each other. And a lot of people have even told me they prefer Ceephax's music over his brother's, though without having the Warp Records marketing machine behind him, he's obviously ended up not getting nearly the same level of attention. I'd known Ceephax existed for years, given that remix he did on Selection 16, but I'd never gotten around to actually checking out any of the music he'd done on his own. He's been regularly at it since the late 90s. He's got a pretty decent handful of albums and EPs from throughout the years. By my count, I believe this project here is his 9th main studio album. I'd even planned on covering his previous album, Camelot Arcade, back in 2018, but that one fell through the cracks and I never got around to it. But yeah, if nothing else, I figure I really need to just finally sit down with his stuff, so that's what I did. I sat down with his other 8 studio albums, not including that self-titled compilation of EPs or that Drive Time bonus album thing, and here's my thoughts on his discography so far. Okay, so I started with his Untitled debut album here, and it is a little all over the place, and a few tracks felt more like shitposts than anything. But I did generally come out enjoying the whole thing. The mix of drum machines and acid synths is pretty openly retro-sounding while managing to not sound all that dated somehow. And as hard-hitting as the more abrasive banger moments are, this project is actually at its best when he sticks in some solid, slightly more downbeat melodies in the mix. For instance, the opener Turrican was excellent. Promising start for sure. Alright, I was not expecting this to be as moody a listen as it was. It's a mix of low-key, atmospheric, Boards of Canada-style analog synth-driven cuts, the usual fast-paced acid techno stuff, and some particularly hard-hitting drill and bass material. Some cuts that combine these two sides of the album sound, but also still having time for a few jokier moments, like his overly creaky voiced rambling on Rolls Royce, or that one goofy synth harpsichord tune, Camelot Jostle, or whatever City Colors is supposed to be. I really liked all of it. One of 2 projects he put out on Reflex. This one's a lot more banger-centric than the last 2, but thankfully these bangers are a lot better than those on his last 2. Have a lot more drive and groove and are just a lot more fun to listen to. This is the kind of stuff I expected to get when I started this little marathon, and he very much delivered. The entire thing absolutely slaps. Also, that freaking intro track had me on the floor laughing. This one was alright, though it didn't have me nearly as consistently pulled in as Volume 1. Had its moments. I really liked the melodies on Acid Schroeder, and thought Vulcan Venture was pretty epic, though most of it kind of fell in the background. Alright then, so this album is split up into 2 parts. The first half, called Ye Old Acid, is apparently some of his really early work when he was first trying to form his style, and the second half, called The Last Fairy, goes for a much more of a straight ambient approach. It will probably not surprise you to hear that the second half resonated with me much more than the first, though I was surprised by how the first half, as rough as it sounds, still feels pretty consistent in its own right. And like an effective lead-up to the second half, the whole thing feeling more cohesively put together than I expected. I'll take it. Okay, this is the project he put out on Planet Mu, seems to be a favorite among fans, or at least the fans who've asked me specifically about it. Also marks a bit of a turn into this much more chiptune-heavy sound, with much brighter melodies that give the project a bit of a rave synth-pop sort of flair. And yeah, it was a ton of fun! The melodies and grooves were excellent, can very much co-sign this as much as everyone else has. Also, the air horns on the track Life Funk and the way he pitches them up and down and integrates them into the tune was really cool. Which is notable, as I believe that will mark the first ever time I highlight the use of air horns in a positive light. I didn't even think it was possible to get me to not cringe at that sound effect, let alone find it legitimately enjoyable or even clever. All the props for that move alone. This one takes a lot of the same sounds and styles from the last album, but totally repurposes them into something that sounds a lot moodier, more retro sci-fi, even occasionally dystopian or post-apocalyptic, but still delivering just as great melodies along the way. While I think the last album had higher high points, I think this one was more consistent and came together as a whole better. Still really solid stuff all around, managed to keep me pretty invested almost the whole way through in spite of its length and general sameness. And this is more the same kind of stuff as the last album, maybe even more downbeat and ambient-centric. Not the most riveting or excitingly produced ambient techno project I've ever heard. Probably a little less investing than Cro-Magnox. But like that album, there are enough striking melodic flares all around to prevent me from tapping out or feeling like we're crossing over into Comtrue's territory. Also, I just like the fact that there's a track on here called The Great Greatsby. I mean, the track's great too, but I just like that title. Which brings us to here. So, I am officially a Ceephax fan now. Took me long enough, I guess. I may not have loved everything I heard from him, but I definitely got quite a few keepers here. He's got his own sound that obviously is very acid-heavy and utilizes a lot of retro synth gear, and yet I never felt like his stuff sounded, like, especially dated, or like his sound is particularly aged since he started. You could have told me Camelot Arcade and the Untitled debut came out around the same time, and I probably would have believed you. But it's not like he's been making the same album over and over this whole time either. He's got some versatility too, and all these albums have had some identity apart from each other. He's obviously not afraid to not take himself seriously and joke around a lot. He often just feels like, you know, some random dude who likes himself some good old TB303 bangers. But he can also pull off atmospheric and moody material pretty consistently well, and has especially proven with his last couple of albums that he's got a real knack for putting together some solid melodies, to the point where it's a strength that he can lean on even on some of his less investing material. Have slightly preferred his more energetic stuff like Volume 1 and United Acid Emirates. Was kind of hoping for something more up-tempo out of this latest album to contrast with his last two, but I just jumped into this with no real expectations, outside of knowing it was gonna sound retro and I was gonna get some solid acid grooves. And while Box Steady is not as up-tempo as those two albums I just mentioned, it did give me pretty much exactly the experience I hoped to get. Box Steady is very much a dance album at its core. Every track has a really solid groove behind it, but neither does it feel like the project is running together into a blur like Cro-Magnox or Camelot Arcade kinda did. All these tracks feel like they have an identity apart from each other. And absolutely you could say that Ceephax isn't doing anything with this album that he hasn't already done before, but when it's this consistently well executed, I really can't bring myself to complain all that much. I'd even go so far as to say this is one of the strongest projects in his catalog to date, and that it could be a great place to start if you haven't heard any Ceephax projects before. I just had a ton of fun with this whole thing. So, yeah, I guess let's go through individual tracks. The project starts really strong with Amigo. Got your prototypical mix of retro synth textures, thick bass lines, banging beats, flashy melodies, and of course plenty of TB303. Perfect kind of album opener, grabs your attention, lets you know what to expect for the rest of the project sound. Great track. And from there, the project as a whole mix of different sounds it explores that are mostly variations on that same typical retro Amiga and acid sound mix you'd expect. There are two tracks that are a little more breakbeat focused in Flangeslab and Darqcyde. The bass lines are a lot more aggressive, the melodies are less focused on, it's all about just creating that banging groove, and of course they slap. Darqcyde even starts out with that same kind of like 80s drum pattern that was in the intro of Orbitals Wonky, which, only a good thing there. There's a couple more laid-back cuts like House Dream, Waltzacid, and News Round, kind of creating a more chill vibe out of those same synth textures. I do like House Dream for its use of these kind of like Robin S. Show Me Love bass lines, and Waltzacid has a lot of ear-catching melodies as you'd hope, and some solid progression over 7.5 minutes. Though I was slightly less crazy about News Round. Felt like that track dragged on a bit too long for its own good, didn't do as good a job of justifying its length as the track it immediately follows. Still a good track though. And all the other tracks on here provide at least something interesting to set themselves apart. He does a cover of like a James Bond soundtrack cue by John Barry called Capsule in Space, done in his usual style, and it is amazing. One of the best cuts on here without question. Those old 60s soundtrack melodies working great, going up against the Giorgio-style bass lines and being implemented into these video game synths. It just absolutely nailing that spacey vibe. Just freaking loved it. You got Galahad, our usual Camelot and King Arthur inspired cuts that brings in a lot of synth harpsichords and creates another total banger out of it. There's a one-off ambient interlude called the Meadow track, which maybe didn't absolutely need to be here, but does help add some more variety to the project and benefits from being the only straight ambient cut on here. And the project's final stretch is totally nailed as well. You got two different tracks inspired by 90s deep house with those old retro house pianos on Fossil Funk and Eurozone. Always gonna enjoy me some house cuts in this style, especially when it's got those piano textures. And both of these have excellent melodies, and the latter made for a particularly satisfying and climactic finish to this project. And in between those two cuts is the track that actually goes the hardest out of all of these, Bureau de Rave. Fastest tempo of any of these cuts, got the super intense acid bass line going over all these whooping voice samples. And I don't really know what else to say about it besides it absolutely goes hard. And that's every track on here. I mean, some Ceephax albums in the past decade or so have had a habit of running on a bit too long, and I was sort of afraid this project might be the same deal, but it didn't turn out that way. If you count the 3 remixes tacked on the end, then yes, that does become a bit much. And I did not care for that alternate mix of Bureau de Rave much at all. But the core 12 tracks of the album only adds up to just over an hour and makes great use of that time. It's really well paced, and there's not a single track on here that I felt like I would want to cut out. It's all really freaking good. If you enjoy yourself these kinds of retro acid grooves, absolutely make sure you pick this thing up. And while it's not like my new favorite project of the year overall or anything, it's got a pretty good chance of at least securing a spot on my year-end list. This was great. Check it out. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on this. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. So leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review, something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.